Rule number one, don't follow Joe. It's unbelievable. You know, before I get into my remarks, which are nowhere as entertaining as Joe's, I want to take a little survey. If you, because I know there's so many people out there, engineers and scientists, people who know so much more than I do. If you believe that humankind's actual impact on the temperature of this planet is minimal, if that, please raise your hand. Okay, now I got that. So I think that that's about 98%. So I was just borrowing this, you know, the methodology that I've been listening to for the last 6 months. So we have one more than they do. They have 97% of all of the scientists. We must have all 98% of all the scientists. That's the type of nonsense that we are up against. You know, Joe's a wrestler, and I'm a surfer. All right, hey, there's my puka shells right there. Never took them off. And I was very pleased today to see that out here they actually have a wave machine in the pool, which is cool. And I am reminded that when I took my class in science, there was, and it was in junior college, the guys in my class who were the really cool guys were the surfers. And there are 4 of the really top guys, top surfers in our area who were part of my science class. And they went down to Baja for a weekend of surfing, knowing that they had to get back for this midterm exam. And when they got down there, there was a problem, and that is the surf was epic. It was unbelievable. And they could not leave that surf behind. And they discussed it. They said, now look, our professor has such a good heart. We'll tell him that we've had a problem, and he'll give us a makeup exam. And so they decided that what they were going to come up with, the idea was that they'd gone down to go surfing. They were going back through the desert in Mexico, and they got a flat tire. But the car didn't have a spare tire. And it took them a full day before a car came along that had a tire that they could use and thus get back in time for the exam, and they would miss it. And they were sure that the professor would give them a makeup exam. Well, that's what happened. They stayed and they surfed the extra couple days. They came back and they told the professor the story about how they got the flat tire and would he give them a makeup exam. And he says, oh, I certainly will. Come in tomorrow morning. So the next morning arrived, and the professor had their blue book exams and the questions right there inside the blue book. Says, okay, you go in that room, you go in that room, you go down the hall, you come over here with me, and go, and when you get done with the test, bring the answers in. And they were so shocked when they got into these separate rooms, and they opened it up and found there was only one question on the test. Which tire went flat? Yes. Aha. So, what we have had is a lot of people over these years telling us that the tire went flat, and we were supposed to believe it. And the fact is, the tires aren't going flat, and there are people who are involved with spreading lies, and they're doing so for various reasons. And one is that there is a power grab to destroy our freedom in this country by people who don't believe in the freedom in this country. We just celebrated the 4th of July, and I know it's very difficult for people to understand. There are some people who don't believe in those principles, don't believe that our founding fathers were this great, image for all of mankind, and this great creation of this country was something that God intended so that we could lead the world into a better way and a better time. They don't believe in that, you know. And of course, there's some people who just disagree with us, who do share our values in terms of democratic government and individual rights. But we do know that there's a lot going on right now of people who are not telling the truth, especially about this issue. I remember the first time that I saw Al Gore, for example. Al Gore, my very first year as a member of Congress, that was 1989, Al Gore comes into the Science Committee, and I was a member of the Science Committee, and took over the front table there, and he was followed by this whole platoon of press men with cameras and everything, and he gets there and he says, "There's an ozone hole that's opening up over the Northeast. I demand that President Bush," that was Herbert Walker Bush in those days, "I demand that he declare an ozone emergency." I remember that. It's really fascinating. I'm watching this. What the heck is an ozone emergency? And what's an ozone hole? And so anyway, come to find out, a few days later, there wasn't an ozone emergency or ozone hole. What was he doing? What had happened was there was a guy in one plane in a little Cessna who had no real training, who basically had some minor equipment, and he determined that the ozone hole was opening up. And Al Gore, a senator, was there demanding an action that would have cost people their jobs, their lives. It would have been dramatically hard on the people of the Northeast, and it was like water off a duck's back to him. Oh, well, I was mistaken. No, we didn't. It really wasn't verified. We have seen that over and over and over again. In 1957, I was born in 1947, so I'm dating myself here. But those of you who have a memory from these days, from 1957, do you remember what really happened that year? That was the year that we couldn't eat cranberries for Thanksgiving. Remember that? No cranberries for Thanksgiving or for Christmas, because they had been declared that cranberries cause cancer. Yep, and I remember for 2 years that we couldn't have cranberries, and of course they found out that was a total nonsense. And today, of course, people are drinking cranberry juice and eating cranberries, and it's just we consume a lot of cranberries, and the cancer rate hasn't gone up. Now, of course, we had very shortly after that, well, not shortly, a few years after that, we had the cyclamate scare. Industry invested all kinds of money in cyclamates, the equivalent of $1 billion probably of investment in research, and cyclamates was a sweetener that that was also low calorie, so it was going to be something they could use for their diet drinks. And then, of course, cyclamates cause cancer. And this went on for a while. In fact, there was a 10-year study on the cyclamates, but during that time period, they weren't permitted to put it on the market. And guess what happened? After 10 years, they found out that it doesn't cause cancer. In fact, they found out the original report was due, and I have it right here, that they had taken rats and they had force-fed them the equivalent of 350 sodas a day per rat. And by the way, the Canadians, after 10 years, they made cyclamates legal again. The Canadians never outlawed cyclamates. They could not get themselves to force-feed those rats. And that's what I guess it was. So what was that all about? We didn't get cyclamates, but we got high fructose corn syrup. That's what was happened. That's what happened when we outlawed the cyclamates. Now, I don't know if the people who make high fructose corn syrup had anything to do with the ban on cyclamates. But we have different groups of people involved in the different uses of power in our country. And I've seen some very abuses of power for political reasons, for some people who aspire to change our system of government, and other people who are manipulating the system for their own profit and their own well-being. We all remember, do you remember what happened on February 26, 1989? That was the day that Ed Bradley on 60 Minutes announced the most potent cancer-causing agent in our food supply is a substance sprayed on apples to keep them on the trees. Followed by Meryl Streep, that's Dr. PhD Meryl Streep, testifying before Congress that this aller was creating cancer among all of our children. And of course, they found that wasn't true either. And what harm did it do after all? Well, it did a lot of harm. We got people in the cranberry business who lost everything. Everything. They lost their farms. They lost their means of income. So certain Americans paid a huge price for that. And same with the apple farmers with this alar scare. But these people basically were out there to try to supposedly do good. Now, I'm not sure whether what was going on. We do know that there are some people who will lie simply because they think that it doesn't matter if they're telling the truth because they're really trying to help somebody. And maybe that's what this is all about. Or maybe there is someone developing high fructose corn syrup and gets the cyclamates so that they're outlawed. Maybe. And I'm not saying that, I haven't verified that that's the case, but it makes me very suspicious. So then it comes along 3 Mile Island. You remember 3 Mile Island? My goodness, wasn't Jane Fonda? That was what a coincidence that she has this movie about the nuclear situation where you have a near nuclear catastrophe. Well, what did that do? What did that do for us? That was, and some of you may know more about this than I do, but I'm looking back now and I just don't see the great number of deaths that were caused by 3 Mile Island. I've been asking around and people just don't have the list of people who were radiated to death, right? Well, we can't worry about that. My gosh, at least we got people attention on this 3 Mile Island. It was a disaster for the development of a brand new industry that was providing energy to our country. It was a disaster for the nuclear industry because they never fully recovered from developing the type of energy that ironically would leave no carbon footprint, right? And it was based, and by the way, let me just note this. I think that light water reactors are somewhat dangerous because now we have the ability to build reactors, high-temperature gas-cooled reactors, thorium reactors, pebble-based reactors, et cetera. We now have the ability to build very, very safe reactors. And that capability would have come along a long time ago if it wasn't for the fact that this whole industry was almost shut down by a stupid PR move by Jane Fonda, of all people. All right, I got a few other examples that I'd like to give you here. And what about the ozone hole? The ozone hole, again, what we're talking about with our Vice President Gore, then Senator Gore. Well, I'm sure there are scientists here who know a lot more about this than I do. But my reading of that is that the ozone hole is sort of like global warming, and it sort of like was an exaggerated position on some readings, and we ended up with the ozone hole. And I have a quote here about the ozone hole from Boyce, is it Rensenberger, then director from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who pointed out that evidence that the ozone hole, that's concentrations of this ozone, are expanding and contracting throughout time. And in fact, the ozone hole after a few years just disappeared. Yet we were all told this was a huge crisis, right? And what happened when that huge crisis hit? We had to get rid of Freon. We had to get rid of all this stuff in the spray cans. How much did that cost us? When we spend billions of dollars needlessly because someone has frightened us into accepting a position, it damages people in our society. When you have less wealth, the people at the lowest rung of our economic sphere are the ones who feel it the most. And now, in this case, of course, what do we have with the ozone? It just also happens that, and again, I'm not making this charge that this was a conspiracy of some kind. I'm just saying that it's certainly worth looking into the fact that Dow Chemical's patent on Freon was ending, and they had a whole new product to take its place. And of course, we had to get rid of the Freon for everybody then to be convinced to get the new stuff. I'm not saying that was the basis of all of this, but it certainly is worth looking into. And I'm saying there are some things that happen in this world by people who are just that cynical and utilize that methodology of frightening the American people, because they realize that we won't give up our freedom, we won't give up our way of life unless we're frightened into it. Look, I remember as a kid, and some of you probably remember, one of the big battles early on was about fluoridation of the water. Remember that? Fluoridation of the water. Well, I don't know whether or not fluoridating the water actually helps people's teeth become better or not. I don't know that. But I do know that in this country, we should be the ones who are deciding what we put into our bodies one way or the other, not the federal government or the local government putting fluoride into our water. And it comes down, a lot of these things come down to freedom issues. They come down to whether or not we will control our own destiny, whether or not the fact that we will be consistent with what our founding fathers had in mind for us in controlling our own lives. Not to say that there won't be problems because of that, because there always are problems. For example, another thing that I remember very well, where people were tried to frighten us, but we had somebody who stood up. Remember acid rain? Acid rain. Now, I happen to have worked for Ronald Reagan during that. Thank God we had Ronald Reagan to stop that nonsense. So acid rain was going to come and destroy all the trees and destroy the rivers and the ponds, and the infrastructure of our country is going to be disintegrating because of acid rain. And Reagan was attacked personally. He was beaten up. They tried to treat him as if he didn't really care about any of those things. And he stood firm and says, no, we're going to have a research project to see if this is real and what can be done about it if it is real. And of course, after 10 years, when they finally finished that study, and that study was submitted to Congress in 1990, and it was the National Acid Precipitation Assessment Project, and they found that basically there was a minimum of human impact on this acidity that they were talking about, and basically it became a non-issue. And however, no one ever retracted what they said, horrible things about Ronald Reagan. They never retracted the fact. And if it wasn't for him, what would have happened? We would have spent billions of dollars, wasted billions of dollars that could have gone into things that help people's lives, could have been left in the pockets of people who want to invest in new businesses and create jobs, or could have actually been gone into research, scientific research, that would come up with some new solutions to the problems we have. But it would have been wasted totally, just like in those other cases. But instead, we had a man of courage as our president. And then, of course, which has already been mentioned, 3 decades ago, the global cooling argument came before us. And we remember, all of you in here I'm sure remember, the adamacy that these people had. They were believing that we were headed towards, because of the weather naturally goes like this, that one of these things meant we were going to go all the way down, and that there would be this cooling, and what a catastrophe. We'd all die frozen deaths. And guess what? Of course, within a very short period of time, it started getting warmer again, because it's just like the cycles that we're in right now, and we continue to be in. And so immediately they changed to global warming. And now, of course, we don't have just global warming. We have all kinds of things here. Climate weirding, climate change, climate disruption. We have every kind of description trying to get away from the fact that they've got an inaccurate prediction to begin with and expect us to go along with it. These are things that either we will have the courage to stand up and say that this is nonsense, this is wrong, the king has no clothes, or we will lose our freedom. And again, it won't be necessarily because the people that we're talking about don't believe in freedom. Maybe they do, but they have this fixation that is more important to them than the result in freedom. When I was a young person, I was a reporter for 4 years in Los Angeles. And I'll never forget these two last instances that I'll give you tonight. And that is, I was called over. First thing is, I was called over to see, there was a report that had been made by some PhDs, and they got together and they were well-financed, and they studied the impact of an oil spill in a coastal area. And they were going to make their announcement, and it was financed by the oil industry, all right. And but these were honest men, and I went down to cover the news story, and these guys were in their white coats. And by the way, I'm sorry that they just couldn't speak in concise. They never could give me a quote. It was always like paragraphs, and so it was very hard to quote them. But there was someone there who was very easy to quote. There was a young girl, and she was standing up with a rubber duck that was covered with oil, a rubber duck, screaming, "Murderers, murderers, murderers," at these guys as they walked in to testify. So of course, she got more coverage than they did. And as she was walking away, I just sort of decided to say, "Well, who are you? And how long have you been studying this issue?" She says, "Oh, well, I don't know anything about this issue." And I said, "Well, what are you doing here?" "Well, I was hitchhiking through town, and the guy said if I would stand up here and yell 'murderers,' he would give me a place to crash tonight." That girl got more coverage than the PhDs who'd spent a year or two really looking into how an oil spill affected the fish and the underlife of the ocean. And then lastly, let me tell you about this. I mentioned I'm a surfer. I'm also a scuba diver. I am a man who likes the ocean. I like the ocean. I'm a waterman. I am not a wrestler, all right? And let me just say that one of my heroes has always been Jacques Cousteau. And I would listen to John Denver, "Hail Calypso," and da-da-da-da-da, and it was, that was my soul. I mean, I really could imagine myself out on that ship and going scuba diving and everything with Jacques Cousteau. And I was assigned to cover a speech by Jacques Cousteau at UCLA. And I went out, and I came and I was listening to the last part of his speech. It was really, really pessimistic. And maybe that's why I went to work for Ronald Reagan, because at least he was optimistic and would give us some hope and say, let's go do this and fix it, rather than lamenting everything is going to hell, okay? So Jacques Cousteau was saying that the oceans are dying. The oceans are dying, blah, blah, blah. And they still, so even then I decided, well, okay, I'm going to report this, but maybe I can ask him a question or two, and maybe he has some optimism that I can add into this story. So there he was, and there's 20, 30 kids after the speech talking to him, and he comes over to me, and I do a little interview, and I said, Mr. Cousteau, aren't there some positive signs as well? I mean, doesn't it look like that someday we'll be able to farm the ocean? Someday that we'll be able to have shellfish or lobsters or things like that are actually grown and like ranches or farms, and there'll be protein that will be available to the world from the oceans that we actually can organize in a systematic way. And he looked at me and he came right up to my face, and he goes, "Didn't you hear me? In 10 years, the oceans will be dead, absolutely dead, black goo." Well, he's a Frenchman. You could smell the garlic on his breath right there. So, whoa, okay. Black goo, I got it. Well, I want you to know that about 6 months ago, I was sitting out in my surfboard, sitting out there outside the break line, and this pelican flew into the water right next to me. And he comes out and he's got a fish in his beak, okay? And there's all kinds of pelicans and birds and all kinds of fish jumping over. And then, sometimes you have this when you're out there surfing, a group of dolphins, porpoises, go by every day. They patrol the coastline if you're in California. If you've never been out there, it's incredible. So they're going by me, and the pelicans are flying in there, and I actually squeak the bottom if you squeak the bottom of your surfboard, they'll come right up to you, and it's really cool. And so I'm looking at this I'm looking at the sea animal there. There he is, this porpoise, and all of this life all around me. And I'm thinking, black goo? I'm going to say something here that's really, really bad, and that is, no, the oceans are alive. Jacques Cousteau died years ago, and now he is black goo. And this is not to say that he had bad motives. He didn't. I'm sure he believed in what he was trying to do, but he got caught up into a clique that demanded conformity and demanded pessimism from him in order to have credibility. Today, it's up to us to confront a crowd that is trying to be so pessimistic that we will give, and trying to put that on us that we will give up our freedom. But it's up to us to defeat that, but to do it in a positive way, to be positive people and offer positive alternatives. And that's why I like people like Fred Singer here and others who have given their lives in this organization, and all of you. We're in this together. We've got to lead humankind to a new plateau, which is what Ronald Reagan talked about, the shining city on the hill. I watched the movie Johnny Tremaine. Raise your hand if you've seen the movie Johnny Tremaine. Okay, let me recommend for you who have never seen it, it's a Walt Disney movie made in 1955. And that movie I show every 4th of July to my kids. God bless my family with triplets 10 years ago. I have 10-year-old triplets at home. We had some other kids over. And Johnny Tremaine is about a young man in the American Revolution. And it all leads up to Lexington Green, where they confronted the British soldiers. And it was really fascinating when I saw this last night, because it became, number one, you had Johnny Tremaine, the ultimate guy. This is Walt Disney's vision, but it was what our people were all about. Found out that he was a relative of one of these wealthy Tories who were supporting the king. And he said, I may give you all of this. You could be part of my family and have all of these servants. And he decided, no, I'm going for freedom, for liberty. And he walked out, and he went to the Battle of Lexington. And as you know, maybe you don't know, that we lost there at the first battle at Lexington. 8 Americans fell dead with British troops firing into us. And the other Americans ran away. But you know what happened? Those Americans stood firm, and the word was out, and the Americans from miles around, heard the noise from the guns, and the bells began to ring, and the American people rushed to join the patriots. If we hold firm, and we stand for truth, and we try to stay positive, and we remember the values that our founding fathers were all about, the American people will rush to us, and we will win this battle. Thank you very much.